The spring season has come and gone, as has a new batch of seasonal titles. And so, much like always, I did my due diligence as your resident crazy man by trying out every new show from this season and only finishing the ones I thought were worth it. So, without further ado, let's dive on in. My Next Life as a Villainess, All Routes Lead to Doom, the movie, serves as a nice bit of recovery after my disappointment with the last arc of Season 2. A tight 90 minutes of setup and payoff with so many proverbial Chekhov's guns that the third act becomes a delightful game of doing that Leo pointing meme when you realize just how much was being foreshadowed. That said, the first half of the film was definitely undercut by a distinct lack of the stuff that made this story so fun in the first place, i.e. being the forerunner of the isekai villainous subgenre, missing that extra spice that made me fall in love with this franchise way back in 2020. It also does its best to earn that movie upgrade in terms of visual quality. The character designs are a bit cleaner and have an extra layer of polish to make their core aspects really pop, and the lighting is a bit more accentuated than in the TV series. It also tries its hand at having a more explosive action scene in the climax, which, while not the easiest to read visually, does have enough forward momentum to keep it exciting. To paraphrase another Anituber, Silverlink has always been the little studio that could, constantly punching above their weight class even when they don't quite have the resources to do so. And that's more or less a good descriptor of what we have here. We haven't quite rebounded back to Season 1 levels, and I highly doubt we'll get much more from this franchise, but at least we got this fun little self-contained story featuring my favorite oblivious villainess. Mono is the delightful combination of Yuru Camp and Yamano Susume that its original author and anime staff pedigree would suggest, with ambitions to match both of those titles in its visual presentation. It immediately became apparent that the biggest appeal of this series is the effort put into how each frame is structured, an effort it consistently delivers on throughout its run. It's been a good couple years since I've seen a cool shots per episode average this high, and the deliberate focus on simply making the frame more interesting, be it through harsher lighting, art style shifts, or, in most cases, using a more complex angle for the layout, which is greatly aided by the story's camera-centric premise, makes this a show that I wanted to keep looking at from start to finish, even if some of it is a bit on the rough side. While it can easily be accused of drifting too far away from its original setting of a photography club, I don't think it was ever meant to be locked down to that one premise, as the variety of other scenarios the characters engage in as a result of said premise seem to grab much more narrative attention, be it food, sightseeing, or even the supernatural. Of course, this also means that there's a much higher chance that you're not going to be as intrigued by any given scenario, with the paranormal ones being a bit lower for me personally, but the fact that the characters are so lively and their chemistry so solid and jovial certainly does quite a lot to smooth over some less engaging moments. If you're hankering for something relaxing, funny, and just a bit different from everything around it, Mono is certainly a good place to start. Windbreaker Season 2 certainly didn't do itself any favors by starting halfway through a story arc, but once it got over that hump, it was back to business as usual. Sakura learning how to get over his extreme self-reliance and how to let himself be supported by his friends and comrades was genuinely very touching, helped along by some great symbolic imagery and color design. And the overall messaging about unity, community outreach, and acceptance were just as solid as last season, with a huge shout out to Tsubaki and their depiction of gender nonconformity. Put all that together, and shockingly, you have a textbook depiction of a functional anarchist society. The problem, however, lies in it being a textbook depiction of a functional anarchist society. Very often its messaging is extremely on the nose, even by anime standards, to the point where it comes off less as a compelling story and more as an ethics lecture, which ends up dulling its overall effect. Despite this, the narrative itself was strong enough to carry me through to the end, as were the many fight scenes scattered throughout this season. This is a delinquent anime after all, and while some cuts felt like they lacked the necessary weight, the big impacts were more than enough to have me shouting guttural grunts at my TV. Most of the other visual aspects are just as solid as last season, be it the crisp and distinctive character designs, or the deceptively engrossing color palette that makes some of the best use of gray tones I've seen as of late, at least until we get to a later entry on this list. Though I'm not quite as hot on it now as I was in Season 1, I'm still having a hell of a fun time and hope that there are more seasons yet to come. Lupin III, Zenigata and the Two Lupins is a prequel short film to a longer film that we probably won't get outside of Japan for a while, but if this entry is any indication of how that one will go, then I am super hyped, as is to be expected from a Takeshi Koike project. The tone is very serious in this iteration, with a focus on terrorism, political scheming, and how far a sense of justice can really take you. And while the big plot reveal does strain suspension of disbelief just a tad, it still strikes a resonant chord with the modern distrust towards any forms of extreme power, and the cavalier attitude with which those in power treat their subjects. The fake Lupin proved to be incredibly captivating despite very little being revealed about him, and Zenigata's struggle with understanding the indifference of those around him gives this story a strong heart as the plot pushes forward. It's also a very graphic take on Lupin this time around, with far more gore and dismemberment than I was expecting, as well as a series of terrifyingly well-animated explosions, though it also has a tendency to dole out a bit too much plot armor when Lupin and Jigen are too close to any given detonation. Action aside, this one's just really great to look at in general, sporting a richness to its color palette despite the bleakly depressing, totally not Russian setting, though the CG crowd shots did draw me out of the moment more than once. I'm still fairly new to Lupin as a franchise, with this being the 4th entry I finished so far, but it's the sheer variety and creativity that keeps me coming back, and this new entry more than scratches that particular itch. Alien Stage is another entry that's technically not quote-unquote anime because it's Korean, and it's probably the only time I'll include a multimedia project on this list, but the music videos alone were more than strong enough to earn a spot here. The well-worn setting and simple yet high-stakes plot make for an intensely dramatic stage on which its assortment of characters compete for survival as they pursue their own interpretations of human connection, regardless of where said interpretation lands on your moral compass. And watching how each character's psyche either fortifies or unravels over the course of the series was tremendously gripping, albeit very brief. There's only about 45 minutes of video content total, but it manages to be extremely efficient at conveying enough information to get you through, though I did end up a little bit confused in some instances. While it's far from the most animated project on this list, with a good chunk being mostly panning shots or lower frame rate cuts, the overall art direction easily makes up for how few hands are at work here. Explosive color work, stunning character designs, and haunting imagery both abstract and direct leave a lasting impression that fill in whatever emotional hole is left unspoken verbally, which happens a lot since there's very little direct dialogue in this series. An aspect I appreciated greatly as it forced me to really sit and think about what these characters were truly feeling. As mentioned earlier, this is a multimedia project, so I'll have a reading order for the webcomic linked in the description to clue you in on the most crucial story beats, as a few of them do contain essential plot details. It might sound like a hassle, but the dramatic humanity of it all more than makes it worth the effort. Rock is a Lady's Modesty is, much like its central characters, rough around the edges but filled with excitement and energy. The performances are easily the main dish for this meal, though I'm still a bit torn regarding my overall opinion of them. On the one hand, I am disappointed that all of the performance scenes use full CG models that aren't particularly blended well with the rest of the shot, especially when crazy hairstyles get involved. On the other hand, the cinematography is so amped up and volatile that it's easy to get lost in the exhilaration most of the time. It also helps that the music fucking kicks ass. Going for instrumentals only was a huge gamble, but it very much paid off in the end both thematically and sonically. The contrast between the monotonous, noble existence our main character pines to mimic in her school life is so extremely juxtaposed against the shrieking vulgarity of her internal craving for rock music that it becomes almost comical in a good way, even if it occasionally oversteps into try-hard territory. I also strongly gravitated towards its discussion of how musicians approach the music they play and what they get out of different styles of play and performance. However, the show occasionally makes the mistake of taking something the characters find boring and tedious and presenting it to the audience in a manner that is also boring and tedious, thus leading me to feel apathy rather than sympathy. Fortunately, the characters and their internal struggles are more than strong enough to pull through when it gets a bit stagnant. Be it a prince-like lady beset with crippling self-doubt, or a seemingly mild-mannered drummer whose only goal seems to be to rock so hard that she comes. Despite its flaws, the biggest of which being you'll have to use High Dive to stream it, this one's a rip-roaring good time that'll have me banging my head for a while longer. Lycoris Recoil, Friends Are Thieves of Time, is a series of shorts that I don't have a ton to say about, but I still wanted to draw attention to because more Lycoreco in my life is always a good thing. It's essentially a bunch of slice-of-life and comedy shorts spread across the timeline of the main series, and it hits its mark with every entry. Whether it's a censor-worthy cocktail or FNAF-esque horror sequences, the variety of premise kept me consistently engaged, as did the shockingly strong art and animation. The average quality of anime shorts is typically much lower than that of full TV series, but Lycoreco absolutely does not skimp on effort. Whether it's gorgeous character designs, stellar color direction, or the intriguing bits of cinematography scattered throughout. As said before, I can never get enough Lycoreco, so if this is just here to remind us that this franchise exists and hype us up for more main series content, then it is certainly a job well done. Mobile Suit Gundam GQuuuuuX is an insanely wild and gripping piece of alternate universe storytelling that only a director of Kazuya Tsurumaki's talent could have handled. Whether it's the gripping and weighty mobile suit fights, the intensely dramatic and moody color design, or the sheer mass of energy with which this production moves, it is, if nothing else, visually enrapturing. I especially loved its depiction of new type perception and how their sensory connection to the world is so emotionally intoxicating. With this show essentially being officially licensed fanfiction, it perfectly weaponizes nostalgia for the original Mobile Suit Gundam to near perfection, creating a perpetual game of seeing what changed, what stayed the same, and how all the pieces of this new timeline lock into place. This also means, of course, that 0079 is required viewing in order to fully grasp what GQuuuuuX is trying to do. Which is perfectly fine in my book, since 0079 is on my short list of absolute must-watch anime. Unfortunately, the climax of this story ultimately got too big for its britches and mostly lost whatever emotional direction it had. And there's one particular plot point that I just fundamentally don't understand in terms of emotional purpose. While I adored Machu's initial presentation as an aimless brat searching for her place in the world, as well as the plethora of intriguing characters that surround her, the final arc of the series became so intensely plot-focused that most of the interesting character dynamics got drowned out in the end. I know this isn't a fair comparison at all, but I'm just not going to remember Machu the same way I remember Amuro. Or, to put it squarely within the realm of Tsurumaki works, the same way I remember Naota or Nono. The best and worst thing I can say about GQuuuuuX is that it's an incredibly entertaining show to watch once. While I don't see much return value, it's at least worth it for the first experience. The Too Perfect Saint, tossed aside by my fiancé and sold to another kingdom, initially struck me as having a set of antagonists that were too cartoonishly evil and stupid, but then I remembered that I live in America in 2025 and everything started feeling uncomfortably familiar. The short-sightedness of selling off the most valuable asset your kingdom has out of pure spite and greed, the unwillingness to admit wrong after it blows up in your face, and the desperation to claw back the people who made your country function and even blame them for what happened once they were gone, felt disquietingly relevant. In contrast, our main character's life in her new kingdom and the kindness and gratitude shown to her by its citizens finally allows her the time and mental bandwidth to develop the aspects of her personality that she had been neglecting for so long, while her younger sister's revenge plot serves as an emotional vent for the audience to enjoy the catharsis of seeing all these evil assholes get what they deserve. While it does occasionally swing a bit too hard towards positivity, the narrative and thematic conclusions that it reaches as a result are more than worth it. And the plethora of fun and engaging side characters leading the plot towards said conclusions were truly delightful or loathsome, depending on their narrative purpose. The only thing I can truly say negatively about this show is that it's not much to look at. While its character designs are generally very pretty and it rarely has any outright jank, it's not exactly a showstopper of a production, with most of its cinematic language limited to medium still shots and panning shots with very little actual animation to speak of. Though admittedly it has a very engrossing pastel color palette and surprisingly solid fire effects. Despite its lack of visual oomph, its narrative was incredibly captivating and had me hooked from beginning to end, desperately yearning for our heroine to finally relax in the life that she deserves. Cocoon is an hour-long TV special brought to us by a slew of ex-Ghibli animators and a director who's worked extensively with Naoko Yamada, and boy does that show in the final product. The Ghibli roots are easily apparent in the character designs and color direction, and Yukimitsu Ina's directorial work is riveting, efficient, and impacting, along with having one of the most twisted visual connections you could possibly draw to Yamada that I won't be showing on screen for spoiler reasons. This next part might be the most obvious take I've ever had, but Kensuke Ushio is easily the best soundtrack composer in the modern anime industry. While his work here isn't particularly standout compared to previous scores, his minimalist style fits the tone of the story perfectly, punctuating the most emotional moments to truly drag your heart down into the depths of terror and despair. The first half does an incredible job setting up the general character dynamics of the main cast, especially that between San and Mayu, with a well fleshed out, though admittedly very obvious metaphor about cocoons tying the thematic conflict within San's character to the main plot. And with the story set at the end of World War II, watching a group of civilian teenagers struggle between desperate survival and resigned defeatism made for an intensely gripping and gut-wrenching second half. Though a tad unpolished in some areas, its dramatic core remains strong throughout and even managed to get me choked up at its climax, reminding us that even in our darkest moments, we still have a choice. Uma Musume Cinderella Grey is the second time I've mentioned an Uma Musume anime in my seasonal recaps, despite me having only made 3 of these so far. And with good reason. This new entry continues to do all the incredible things that you'd expect from this franchise, be it compelling rivalries amongst extreme and captivating personalities, heart-pounding races with some of the best pacing and editing in modern TV anime, and deceptively strong sound design that adds extra power to every impact of foot against racetrack. I'm also still amazed that they took a perpetual gag character like Ogre Cap and turned her into such an endearing lead through a combination of raw visual excess and a sympathetic backstory. The wide array of competitors they place her against and how she relates to them, be it the sheer contrast against the straight-laced Fujimasa March, or the kindred spirit found in the boisterous and commanding Tamamo Cross, were insanely entertaining, even compared to rivalries of past seasons. And seeing Simbali Rudolph finally play a more direct role in the plot after so many entries of her as a peripheral icon was immensely gratifying. It also has some notable differences that make this entry stand out from the others. There's a much more direct sense of conflict amongst the main characters, with the overall tone being the most serious, borderline edgy that we've gotten so far. Though it still has that trademark silliness that perfectly diffuses the tension when need be. And the color palette and lighting are much starker and more desaturated in order to match this tonal shift without drifting too far into being drab or lifeless. In short, it's more Uma Musume, which means it's incredible, and I can't wait for part 2 to air in a few months. The Apothecary Diaries Season 2 is, as expected, my favorite of the season by a long shot. Though I wasn't quite sure it would be at first with how its first core played out. The episodic mysteries slowly building up to larger plot points was as enrapturing as always, constantly leaving you just enough clues to figure it out yourself while obscuring them enough to not make it obvious, but it felt like it was missing some of the punchier moments that made Season 1 so memorable. Oh boy, did I get my wish in the second half as the dark legacy of the former emperor begins to spill into the open and engulf everyone unfortunate enough to be involved in it. The dread overflowing as you realize what the hierarchy of the royal court has done to those not privileged enough to run it, the lives it has utterly devastated in its wake, and the inevitable consequences of it all. And with Mao Mao further settling into her life at the palace and making deeper connections to those who reside there, the ending makes it all the more tragic and melancholic. As for visuals, it's basically just as solid as last season. Striking character models, a sharp attention to detail, impeccable color design, and a knack for framing and cinematography that constantly keeps you glued to the screen. That said, it's also begun showing signs of a very strained production in the slightest of ways, which seems corroborated by how many episodes were outsourced to a different studio. Though I suppose the fact that I couldn't tell which were which is a testament to its consistency. Despite this, as well as my mild frustration with the constant will they, won't they rug pulls between Mao Mao and Jinshi, I'm definitely going to be thinking about this season long after it's finished, as I bask in the Pyrrhic victory of its resolution and anxiously await a release date for Season 3. And that brings us to a close on yet another season of anime. If I did this right, I think I actually got this one out before the end of the month, so hopefully future me didn't get lazy and start playing Civ or something. Next month is gonna be a bit more of an editorial style video to explain how I became the crazy man that tries out everything. And if you're curious about other future videos, head on over to the Patreon to check out some of the free posts there. If you really like me, maybe consider throwing in a few bucks a month for some behind the scenes stuff and early access to main channel videos. And as always, be sure to like and subscribe so you can stay up to date on all my latest content. Special thanks to Rourke Tenjoin, Chris Adili, Ryan Johnson, Lou Nuxor, and all my other patrons for their generous support. My name is Ember, and I'll see you next time.